Good morning, everyone. We are back for another section of Music 1300. I am, of course, Professor George. We are done talking about, well, at least in terms of being the only thing that we're concerned about, texture. We're going to still revisit that through all the listening examples that we cover today. But for the start of lecture, we need to start talking about a totally new area and dimension of music, and that is rhythm and meter. So texture, in addition to rhythm and meter, are probably some of the most salient features of a piece of music. So texture, we were talking about musical density, the idea of different layers that are ongoing in a piece of music at one time. And we're going to increase our vocabulary a little bit and talk about we're going to talk about rhythm. And rhythm is a really important aspect of music because it's one of the first things that we kind of intuit of a piece of music. Usually when we're listening to something, we will like move our body or even tap our finger or our foot to something, and that's usually how the piece is metrically or rhythmically aligned. So meter refers to kind of the overarching framework that we superimpose on a piece of music. And today we're going to talk about music of the 1980s. We're just going to talk about one particular metric construct, and that is the construct of simple time, which is probably the thing that we listen to most in popular music. So we're going to start off really easy, and then from this, after today's lecture, we'll start encountering some more rhythmically diverse pieces of music, but we're going to start off nice and simple today. So as always, one of the things that's really helpful to have whenever you start lecture with me is a piece of paper in which to take notes on, and also my one sheet, which is in either Blackboard or Dropbox for you. It's again what the whiteboard would look like if we were to be doing this in person in class. I also have my digital whiteboard, which I'm going to toggle over to really quick to start illustrating some of my ideas about rhythm and meter, in addition to recapping where we left off for our last lecture. So before we begin listening examples, let's talk about terms and understanding how rhythm and meter even apply to music. So let me toggle over to my whiteboard. All right, so let's review first. We talked about texture. Ooh, that's a little big. There we go. Texture during our last class, all right? And texture is like how many different layers are going on at a time, or what's otherwise going to be referred to as density of musical material, all right? We also figured out that texture ranges from simple to complicated. The simplest one that we encountered is monophonic texture. One thing happening and everyone doing the same thing in unison. Homophonic, which is like 90% of what we listen to, boils down to, for the most part, melody and accompaniment. One thing of primary interest and then everything else supporting that idea. We also have heterophonic texture, which again is a lot of melody and accompaniment, but the difference here is that melody has a lot of call and response characteristics to it. So it generally plays the musical game of Marco Polo. Our most complicated texture that we don't hear particularly often, because it's kind of like having more than one conversation delivered to you at a time, is polyphonic, which comes in two varieties. Imitative, which we hear way more often than the non-imitative variety. Essentially, this is melody, melody, accompaniment, for the most part. All right, so those are our bigger categories in terms of texture, which is something we're going to continue being concerned about from now until the end of the semester. So if you think you are going to get away from these terms, you are sorely mistaken. So that's a little bit of review. So for all of the listening examples that we're going to do from the 1980s, we're also going to talk about texture today. We're going to, what we figured out from our last lecture is that things seem to fit really nicely generally within the homophonic or heterophonic category. We're going to sort of draw our attention to rhythm and meter today, though. Rhythm in music is expressed using a combination of symbols, and those symbols relate to how long an event is, whether it's an event of sound or an event of silence. So this is a little bit of music notation. There's a whole other class that talks just about music notation, Music 1400 class, which generally goes into the music theory sequence. We're not going to talk a ton about how music is notated, but it's really important to know that music does have a whole combination of symbols in which to convey the musical material that you are hearing. Music notation in regards to rhythm, let's talk about how long events last. So durations. Here's something, durations of sound. There's something that's called, or what I call, the rhythm tree, that breaks up how these symbols relate to one another. And the first duration, like the length of which a note takes, so that we're going to deal with, is it's a symbol that looks a lot like a circle. This is indeed something we call a whole note. Okay. Now, a whole note can last for as long as I want it to. How long each of these durations of sounds lasts is generally given as a part of the information of decoding in a piece of sheet music as like a symbol equals a number. This whole thing we call BPM, or really a metronome marking. It tells you that a symbol equals a number. For example, whole note equals 60. 60 what? Beats per minute. So 60 beats per minute. That's otherwise 1 second. Oop. 1 second of sound. So 1 Mississippi, 1 Mississippi, 1 Mississippi, 1 Mississippi. That is what that symbol means in the context of this particular music composition. I can have that equal whatever I want it to. It could equal, you know, if I wanted to be somewhat absurdist, like 4 years. Whole note equals 4 years. Okay, well, that starts to become more relevant as we figure out some maybe perhaps different durations. So a whole note, like a whole, I usually start talking about pi during this part of the semester, a whole note or a whole pi. A whole note or a whole pi, if you wanted to divide it out into 2 equal components, creates two half notes. This is relevant because in like our earlier example where whole note equals 60 beats per minute, a half note is going to take half the amount of time. So if a whole note equals 1 second, a half note is half of a second long. So all of a sudden these durations start to relate to one another. Again, thinking about pi, if I want to divide out a pi into 4 equal components, I have quartered my pi, and these symbols are indeed quarter notes. All right. If I have more friends over for my party and I like say indeed 8, I want to divide up my pi into 8 equal components. We do indeed have 8 notes. These little things over here are called flags. The little doohickey that hangs off of the note. They can be indeed beamed together. These ones are singular. These ones are grouped together. They are still the same duration, though, 8 notes. Further dividing out, if we divided an 8th slice of pie into 2 equal components, we would indeed have 16th notes. Or if they were beamed together, in this case, we just add an additional beam on the top. So 16th notes. You can further divide out your pi if you wish, 64th notes. I'm gonna not write it out anymore, but like you just gain an additional 1, 2, 3 flag on the side, or if they're beamed together, it looks a little bit like that. Do you notice that like, it's hard on the digital whiteboard, but also that like the 64th notes are like a little bit harder to read. 16th notes are a little bit easier to read. 8th notes are fairly easy to read. Quarter notes are easiest to read, sort of. We choose durations in a piece of music based on the ease of readability. So the rhythm tree is a relatively abstract term or abstract piece of information. However, these are used to convey the rhythmic material that we're listening to in a piece of music. And they're usually done so in regards to a particular meter. So meter. Meter is a term that you're probably most aware of in regards to poetry. Meter refers to sort of the combination of stressed and unstressed events that happen in a piece of music. And there are a couple of very similar common constructs that we listen to in regards to meter. So the first one that we're going to be concerned with is something we call simple meter, in which we group the ideas into groupings of 2. Meter in a piece of music is expressed in a time signature. And a time signature always occurs as a number over a number at the beginning of the piece of music. The top number always means the same thing, the number of beats in a measure. How many pulses we are listening to before we come to an accented pulse again. The bottom number is what gets the beat, the unit. What unit gets the beat? Okay, well, we just spoke a great deal about units in regard to the rhythm tree. The bottom number, like I said, stands in for a unit, in which case half notes are represented by the number 2. Quarter notes are represented by the number 4. Eighth notes, 8. 16th notes, 16. 64th notes, 64. Great. Half notes, like I said, 2, whole note, 1. So there are only a specific specific selection of numbers that are available to you on the bottom. 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, 64. If you wanted to further divide out the rhythm tree, you could, but in general, we tend to see 4, 8, and 16 more often than any other numbers. Let me explain why that is. So I said the bottom number that we see in a time signature is usually a 2, 4, 8, or 16, or more commonly 4, 8, or 16. And part of the reason why is because choosing one of those numbers gives us some amount of mobility to go up or down on the rhythm tree, to divide out time further into smaller increments, or to combine rhythms into larger beats or pulses. I usually find it helpful to talk about a kitchen scenario. So imagine that you are in a kitchen and you have to bake a cake, and you have only one measuring cup that you are able to use for the entire recipe. If we think of a measuring cup as though it's a duration, perhaps you might like to use a quarter of a cup as your measuring device. Why? You might have things that are smaller than a quarter of a cup, but you can probably eyeball it from a quarter of a cup with some amount of, accuracy. And if you have to do things that are like a full cup, you're not like measuring out too many small increments to equal a large one. So that's kind of like the thought there, is that the durations that are right in the middle of the rhythm tree give you a little bit of mobility upwards and downwards to be able to combine or further divide out rhythmic durations. So that's a lot of information. It's a lot of information that's incredibly abstract as well. These all are going to make so much more sense when we actually listen to a number of listening examples. So I have filled up my whiteboard. I have a couple other things to talk about in regards to meter and specifically simple time, which is what we're going to be listening to. So the beginning of the next part is going to have a little bit of my whiteboard, but illustrating some of these things through different listening examples. It will be likely that you will want to watch this video again to make sure that you picked up on all of the points. Big things here: the rhythm tree and what it means, the metronome marking or the beats per minute and how that relates to the rhythm tree, and then the idea of meter, that we have a number over a number, and that the bottom number refers to things within the rhythm tree. So the rhythm tree is like really important to kind of get a grasp on. And again, these are just durations. They are components or parts. So I think a lot about like measuring cups or recipes sometimes when I think about the rhythm tree, because they are proportional to one another. Have you ever seen a recipe that's like 3 parts flour, 1 part sugar, or something like that? Those parts, you get to choose what the duration is, whether it's a quarter of a cup or a half of a cup or a whole cup, but the proportions are always the same. So the rhythm tree works really, really similarly. Again, a lot of these things are going to kind of be a little bit more demystified when we actually talk about particular listening examples. So part 2, we'll do a little bit more discussion, but also illustrating some of these terms through the listening examples, and also, again, talking about texture. All right, I'll see you guys for part 2.